you guys are two of my interlocutors and favorite individuals in the world, and perhaps two people I would say that I would please don't be uncomfortable if I say I think you're both geniuses of some kind, and also I think you're both very almost different types of characters. In almost an extreme polar opposite way. Like John is so conscientious and careful about, everything he says, and Alexander's out there on Twitter offending everybody, beating on his Nietzschean hammer. And so I love both those perspectives. I think they're both great, even though, some people would have a hard time with Alexander, and some people would not be able to get into the intricacies of John. And
well said. Well said.
I love it both. I love you guys both like so much, and you've both you've expanded my life, my mind in so many ways. So I want to first start by thanking you and saying that I'm really, thrilled to be having this conversation.
John here is famous for a series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Highly recommended. Every damn minute of those 50 plus episodes are fantastic. So it's just the cheapest, smartest possible short route to understand the history of the West would be to follow Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Then he ends up with Paul Tillich as the solution, which is kind of surprising to me, at least, but we can get back to that later. Highly, highly recommended. I'm in the process of writing a trilogy with John Söderqvist, where the first two books are called Synthesis, Creating God in the Internet Age, and Digital Libido, Sex, Power, and Violence in the Network Society, which is very prophetic at the moment. But these two books are set to be followed by a third and last book, which is tentatively called Process and Event. And I am on fire about discussing some of the things I'm working with at the moment for that book with John tonight, and certainly with Andrew's input too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And me and John, in our last couple conversations with Zach and Christopher Mastro Pietro, have been talking about, reinventing ideas, reinventing perennial notions, and rethinking things. And something that's been coming up on the intellectual dark web discussion is this idea of a renaissance.
Intellectual deep web.
Intellectual deep web, excuse me. It's this idea of a renaissance.
Keep the kids' stuff separate from the parents, okay? Always.
It occurred to me that Alexander wanted to talk about the past, right? A renaissance. And then John is talking about reinventing, and that's a futuristic idea. Whereas, on the other hand, Alexander's very much of a futuristic philosopher, and John is also working on perennial issues. I hope that doesn't sound all confused, but I wanted to somehow combine the idea of reinventing the new world, the new paradigm, whatever's coming next, which everybody seems to be agreed that we're moving into an entirely new era. I want to talk about reinventing these things, and then maybe Alexander you can talk about this comparison between the axial age and the Bronze Age.
Oh yeah, what happened was that I did a fantastic podcast called Techno-Social Podcast, run by two of these wonderful whiz kids, Oliver Cox and Dan Fraga.
I've been on there.
They're intellectual deep web. Now you get it. So Owen and Daniel then invited both me and Patrick Ryan to have a conversation. And Patrick Ryan is an amazing North American young mind, right? So, and both Patrick Ryan and I have been working towards to sort of re-emphasize the difference between the Bronze Age and the Axial Age, because the Axial Age has always been sort of overrepresented and hyped, and this is a wonderful period when all these great thinkers came forward. But in reality, I think the Bronze Age was actually the constructions and the sort of the meta structures that we can now use or have used ever since were created. And I'm working with that shift in this new book I'm doing, and Patrick Ryan is doing the same thing simultaneously, interestingly enough. And I want to address that because there are some core issues here that are very, very important. And I'd love to get into that tonight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and John has talked a lot about the Axial Age, and you've criticized certain aspects of the Axial Age, but I think that you're very much also you also appreciate a lot of the Greeks, and you've said that the Axial Age is kind of the grammar of how we think about things and that sort of thing. So maybe can you respond to Alexander?
Well, I think
to that thought.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the word I'd like to use is reinventio rather than reinvent, because inventio captures both invention and discovery. It's not quite like just remaking. So it's sort of the point about the inventio is it's a Janus-based term. It looks back, right, to what has already been discovered, but it looks forward to what is to be invented, and it's supposed to sort of be beyond them, which I think is appropriate for what we're trying to do here. I think we're actually exemplifying that. And about the axial age and the Bronze Age, I think there's a strand of my thinking that might connect up with what Alexander's saying. So I'll propose it, and then we can see if we can riff on it. And this is the idea, and I get this from Charles Taylor, right, in the distinction between the continuous cosmos and the two-world mythology. And then part of my critique of the axial age is that for all of the benefits that Alexander already alluded to, it has entrapped us into this two worlds mythology that has been very, very problematic and has become increasingly problematic, precisely because I think one of the things the scientific worldview has done is, and I think there's a lot of benefit to this, it has re-embedded us, and I want to use that word, re-embedded us back into a continuous cosmos. And so in some sense, we're back to a worldview that is strongly but strangely analogous to what we had in the Bronze Age, but we're also trapped within, several world religions and philosophical systems that have become deeply enmeshed in a two worlds way of thinking. And so part of what I think the struggle we're facing, and part of what I would what I want to reinventio is, because I think this is what cognitive science is pointing towards, what does it mean for us now to be, I'm going to try and use terms that are loaded and therefore we should probably explode them, but maybe explore them. What does it mean to be spiritual beings within a continuous cosmos? Because we have typically understood spirituality with two worlds language, and I think that we are getting back to
John, would you like to just elaborate on what you mean with two world philosophy? So those
and also what I'm hearing is that's a dualistic worldview, right? As opposed to a monist worldview.
So I want to be clear that I think that this mythology does tap into phenomenological experience in an important way. I'm not doing some sort of logical positivist move here. But what I mean by the two worlds mythology is an attempt to understand the human capacity for self-transcendence by positing two different worlds that differ in some fundamental way in how real they are, or how important they are, or valuable they are. And of course, this is a hypothesis.
So this world is an illusion, or this world is unreal.
This world can be an illusion, or it can be a decadent world, or a fallen world, or there's many ways in which it pales in comparison. And I mean, this was the lightning rod for a lot of Nietzsche's invective, right? He really objected to this way because he hit one of his core ideas is that as science removes the plausibility of the upper supernatural world where all the value ultimately adheres, what we get a kind of nihilism. We get this world, which was always understood only in instrumental and comparative terms, and that's part of the history of nihilism. And I think that's an important point Nietzsche made, because I see what he's doing. He's bringing these two ideas together. The scientific world is collapsing us, putting us back into a continuous cosmos, and yet because of the two-world grammar, the only way we can now relate to that, unlike how people related to it in the Bronze Age, the only way we can relate to it is in a nihilistic fashion. And like Nietzsche and a lot of the post-Nietzscheans like Heidegger, I want to understand that deep continuity with the world, with the continuous cosmos, in a positive way, in a life-affirming way, in a way that provides a new grounding for spirituality and the cultivation of wisdom. And that's what I see 4E cognitive science affording. And that's why I turn to it as a resource.
Okay, I'll come in here. You know that I'm a Zoroastrian, and I've accused you of being a Buddhist. Probably you're not. So there you go. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, what I did was that I went through all the texts from the 19th century. Hegel and Nietzsche both proposed Zoroaster as the beginning and the end of all morality. And found out that they actually did study the Avesta. They studied Iranian culture intensely. It was high fashion in Germany in the 19th century. And that led me back to the original religion of Zoroastrianism. I converted in 1992, and I started exploring it. And I find it very interesting that this is like the peak of the Bronze Age. This is like 1700 before Christ in Central Asia. The Zoroaster appears. He locks himself up with a guy called Vishtaspa for 23 years. And then they walk outside of the door and they, reveal a new world religion or a reformed religion, as they would have be adamant they did. It's similar to what happened in India with Brahmanism versus Hinduistic folk religion. But what they did in Persia, and I found that very interesting. What later happened was that we had several Persian empires that lasted for over 1,400 years after that. And Egypt only attempted one empire that lasted for about 6 or 7 years. It was a complete tyranny. Now, how did the Persians avoid creating a tyranny? And this way, it's where it gets interesting. What they took was something that existed already in nomadology, sort of the original religion of people on the move. Say people on the move that will go into a mode of what Mircea Eliade would say, the eternal return of the saint. And that's like the only story you've got. Every new year is a new world, but it's the same world as last year. That's all there's to it. And what Zoroaster uniquely adds, 1700 before Christ, is the idea that we could have another narrative that I call eventology. This is a narrative of linear time where things are happening following the arrow of time, and an event can happen that is so dramatic that it changes the rules of the world forever. So this is the original eventology. But what the Zoroastrians did long before the sort of pop versions called Islam and Christianity pop up later and cause a lot of trouble, was that the Zoroastrians understood that they divided the leadership between the chieftain and the priest, and they must always be separated. So in Persian culture, that means you have the Shah and Shah, the king of the kings, and he would have his own capital, his own court, and he would run affairs from there. We'd call it executive power today in America, right? And then you have legislative power, would be the priests, and the head priest would be called the Mobed and Mobed, the priest of all priests. He would have a separate capital, separate courts, and run things from there. This was the system the Zoroastrians implemented in the Persian Empire for the next 1,400 years, and they avoided tyranny. So when the Egyptians later mimicked it with Akhenaten, 400 years later, probably because they only had one river, they didn't have two rivers that had to sort of communicate with each other. You just had the Nile. And of course, Akhenaten came up with the idea that there should only be one pharaoh who talks, he alone talks to the sun god. And there's no rain god any longer, it's just the sun god. And this, of course, creates the ultimate tyranny. When we look at systems like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, in the last 100 years, they're all sort of mimicking Akhenaten. And of course, North Korea today. So what they did in Persia was that they separated the chieftain and the priest, which is actually very logical for any sort of construction you do with men. If you're going to organize men into an army or a hunting team or whatever, you got to have one guy he's the king of the mind, and another guy who's the king of the body. And I think this is where it gets confusing later, when the Gnostics, that the Zoroastrians went after aggressively when the Gnostics appeared. When the Gnostics started happening in the Persian Empire, this is like the Sassanid Empire, the last major empire before the Muslims came. So from the 3rd to the 5th century, you had the Gnostics all over the place. They were called Mastakites, they were Manichaeans, and the Zoroastrians went after them because these guys took this idea and then put it into the body and separated body and mind and created the dualism.
So that's the two-world mythology.
Yes,
right?
And it's interesting that Zoroastrianism is aggressively monist. And to me, if you stop looking at the West and whatever happened with the West, it essentially starts with the Jews and the Greeks, whatever came afterwards. But if you look at the West in a more expanded sense, the Middle East, with just Europe and America hanging on later, and then the East is China and India, we can then discover that in Eastern narrative, it's absolutely fundamental that the world is monist. And dualism only catches on with these Gnostic sects. And to me, they've always caused the havocs that we have later, with the pillar saints and the boy pharaohs and the ideas of perfection and infinity and immortality. All those ideas that are totally devoid of any sort of foundation in reality are all the results of that.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to respond to that, John?
That
narrative?
I'm not. I mean, I've studied a lot of Persian history. My partner is actually Persian. But I think Alexander probably still knows much more of it than I do. So I would hesitate to comment on the historical things. I would say that I guess it's more of a question that, because on many people, many scholars that I've read, they tend to put Zarathustra later, and they tend to put him in the axial age.
That's totally wrong. Totally, I can prove it. His language was completely Vedic. This is 1700 before Christ, certainly. And it's also prior to Akhenaten, which arrives 400 years later, which is just mimics the whole system the Persians created. So you can, the reason why they want to put Zoroaster like 600 before Christ, just to make him one of the axial age guys, one among the others. But there's no influence in Zoroaster's work from any Plato, any Confucius, or any of the other guys at all. Rather, Heraclates is the one of the Greeks who's Zoroastrian. If you study Heraclates' fragments in Zoroaster's Gathas, it's strikingly similar in thought patterns. And this is exactly why Heraclitus' concept of the logos is completely different from the biblical concept of the logos, because Heraclitus' concept of the logos is just straightforward Zoroaster's Asha, which later becomes Tao in Taoism. So it's just how things operate, basically. That's what Asha is. And this is why logos, to me, is...
So logos is the way? Logos means the way? Like how
no, wait a
things are?
second.
Like
just cut the Chinese. Just cut the Chinese
I
out.
don't know.
Whatever they just mimic it.
I'm trying to understand.
Get us back to Zoroaster and Heraclitus, not confuse it too much. But it's Zoroaster's concept of Asha. Asha means, in ancient Persia, means how things work. That is logos to the Persians. This is what Heraclitus picks up on. And then they take logos as separate from mythos, which is how we then create a story about ourselves to make sense of the world. And we can allow it to fabulate whatever. And we keep that separate from the logos. And there's also a third story with the Persians, which is Pathos. And Pathos is anything you want to keep your kids away from: sex, violence, art, and radical transformation of any kind. So I'm working on these three different types of narratives that we constantly confuse with one another, and that's exactly what we still do it today. We can't keep them separate, but we must keep them separate to understand the different roles they have.
Okay, so I want to slow down. Let me make sure I've got the three. There's logos,
Mythos.
Mythos. I've done a lot of work on logos and mythos, so maybe we can talk more about that. Pathos. I mean, I have a literary understanding of it, but I don't have a philosophical understanding. So
you watch pornography. Okay, it gets silly when pornography tries to be theatrical. If they have lines in the pornography, it's just in the way. You'll go straight to the fuck.
So
that is pathos. That is pathos.
So I'm trying to get the connection that I know in Aristotle between pathos and what becomes pathetic and things like that, and the pathetic fallacy. I
avoid pathetics. I say pathic narrative to avoid pathetic. Like pathology also is a misnomer these days. Although in say psychoanalysis, you use pathology exactly the correct way.
So the pathic
state of your mind, right?
The pathic is sort of the artistic primordial, beyond good and evil, Dionysian, Nietzschean world.
Okay, so and your claim, Alexander, is that these were appropriately related in Zoroastrianism.
Yes,
and they have become sort of mixed up and confused in more modern thought or more recent thought.
Well, they've also replicated successfully, and you see the pattern when the Jews rewrote the Exodus out of Egypt. It was no longer just an Egyptian prince called Moses, but actually the three siblings: Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So in this triad of power, the split follows, and the matriarch. The matriarch obviously is the older sister, Miriam, and the chieftain is obviously Aaron, and the priest is obviously Moses. And that's exactly why the Exodus makes sense with the three siblings. And that was, of course, a retelling of the Exodus out of Egypt that the Jews were inspired by the Persians when they later wrote and rewrote the Old Testament. So you see the same pattern in the American Constitution that the French helped the Americans write, clearly inspired by the Persians. So it's just like, you got president, you got Congress, and you got the ultimate matriarch is the Supreme Court, holding the other two guys responsible for whatever they promised to keep. So you have this strong triad that returns constantly in nomadology, returns constantly in storytelling of how you actually split power to keep it stable over time and to avoid tyranny.
So I'm trying to, okay, so the idea then, so circling back, what does this have to do with the relationship between the two worlds and sort of the one world? I'm trying to get the connection between.
Okay, when you got the chieftain and the priest separate, you just know that the two different qualities belonging to the same body. Right. The body and mind are united. Persians don't allow them ever to be split. It's a monist worldview. You're one. Body and mind together. It's just two different aspects of the same system. So that's exactly why in Zoroastrianism, the ultimate god is Ahura Mazda. That's two different aspects here. Ahura is being and Mazda is sense. So Mazda is actually your mind and Ahura is the body. But the Zoroastrians are adamant that they actually do worship the mind, but not without the body and never separate from the body. It's just that that's uniquely human. So that's why they call themselves Mazda Yasni, and that's exactly what the Zoroastrians call Buddhist, Ahura Yasni. And they think of the Buddhists as a complementary religion to their own religion. It's just a focus. You can basically choose. Do you want to go into the phallic mode? Do you want to go forward? Do you want to create a futurology? Do you want to create a vision and a strategy towards the future where humanity should go? In Exodus, then you go into Zoroastrianism and you immerse yourself in that experience. If you go into Buddhism, for example, then you isolate yourself. You go into a different mode, which is more matriarchal, but that mode can complement the other one.
Yeah, we've had this conversation a lot, and I always say that the Vajrayana is a mixture of those two things.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And Dzogchen certainly is. Dzogchen mixes two intensely.
Because Vajrayana, the Vajra is a phallic symbol. It's a cutting through. So it combines the matriarchal and the patriarchal.
So what later happens is we get the pop religions, the vulgar versions of this, and we got the 11-year-old boy pharaohs and the 11-year-old pillar saints during the axial age to declare new truths. And they then completely mistake. For example, you got a concept in Persian philosophy, is a Horvatat, which is like the goal of your life. Horvatat, which means wholeness. Horvatat everywhere has been translated to perfection. No, there was no Platonism here. It's not perfection, it's wholeness, just having lived a whole life. You got another word in Persian philosophy is ameritat, which should be translated as transcendence, meaning that which transcends you. So the day you die, and remember the Persians never built pyramids. They just throw the corpses out in the deserts, right? They don't build pyramids at all. When you die, but your memory will be celebrated for the next 70 years at the moment of your death every year. It's called Polgasar in Persian culture. And that is the point. So you are basically passing on, by dying, you're passing on the world to the next generation. This is what the Persians meant with Ameritat, but every damn translation of Zoroastrian scripture has always translated Ameritat as immortality, which again is this Gnostic Platonist idea to me, okay? So it's perfection, immortality, and infinity do not exist in Persian thinking. It will be unfathomable because they're not real. Mm-hmm. But later with the Gnostics, at least to the Persian, this is the Persian perspective, with the Mastakites, we should both the origin of Islam and socialism. And later with the Manichaeans that inspired Christianity greatly, because through St. Augustine, that's a major influence on Christianity, which Christianity has always been torn with and struggled with. The Gnostics came along and said, it's a true world. We need a true world mythology, and body and mind must not meet. And that is only because they want to make the mind superior to the body, so the body belongs to the evil world of the demiurge, and the mind is clean and fine and fantastic.
Mm-hmm. So let me make sure I'm understanding you correctly. You're proposing that if we understood Persian philosophy and Zoroastrian religion, we would have an alternative framework for a continuous cosmos that might be more properly aligned with the scientific worldview, because that's
with process philosophy too. Maybe am I off there?
Oh yes, and the Persians thought nothing but process. Everything was process to the Persians, but everything was process even prior to Zoroaster. Zoroaster had a process philosophical worldview. Everything was about change. Another beautiful term in Persian philosophy is frashokereti. Frashokereti is what Zoroaster aspired to. It's an ever-refreshing world of novelty. Could you think of a better term for creativity than that? That is the highest ideal in Zoroastrianism. So they pursue this. I think the structure I'm building in a simplified way for the new book is to say we had two grown-up complex religions coming out of the Middle East called Zoroastrianism and Judaism. And then we unfortunately got two vulgar pop versions called Christianity and Islam. And maybe we should go back to the roots, actually all the 4,000 years back, and actually find out the richness of Middle Eastern culture.
Mm-hmm.
The Indians could do the same.
There's a billion Islamic people and a billion Catholics, and there's such a small amount of Zoroastrians. I think even less than Jews. Is there going to be a Zoroastrian Renaissance or?
Okay, can I tell you guys one thing? Because you're Canadians and too influenced by America. Can you stop thinking quantity? Okay. America is obsessed with quantity. Okay, the rest of the world tries to aspire for quality. It's the difference between art and mediocrity. Okay, so you can just go for the quality here, because at the end of the day, we're not responsible for, turning the world into Zoroastrian world and things like that at all. Zoroastrians don't care what religion you pick. It's one of those religions that has the grace to not be missionary religion. So it's just you're invited to conversation that actually is way older than Christianity and Islam. And also to understand why those two religions became so successful, why they were widely spread, because they were just the easy pop versions. Basically, they promised direct access to God, which most people can't handle anyway. It's just any working class mom would say, no, she wants her idols. She wants her saints. She wants somebody to talk to. She doesn't want to talk to God. The priests are supposed to talk to God. No, I've talked to the lesser gods. That's why Catholicism is probably much better off in the future than Protestantism, because Protestantism is a ridiculous idea that you could sit and talk directly to God and he would care about you directly. It's just preposterous, right? But for Zoroastrians, there's that division. We call it the Bard Absolute, you and I, Andrew, the separation between God and man, where the priests are supposed to keep that area, right? And that's why, in Zoroastrianism, you have folk religions in parallel. That's exactly why universal human rights were invented by the Persians. It wasn't an accident. It was invented because they totally accepted that the average normal guy would go and practice a folk religion, have any god or goddesses they wanted. They talked to the lesser gods. They have saints who were basically role models that they could mimic to create a good society. Whereas for the priesthood themselves, it was all about Ahura and Mazda.
So, I've talked to other Zoroastrians, and they don't talk the way they don't talk the way you do, Alexander. To be fair, and so what? I'm asking you this as a friend, and honestly, what's the relationship between your take on Zoroastrianism and the average Zoroastrian? Because it sounds very different.
Yeah, I've done interviews several times for Parsiana magazine in India, and I've spent so much time in India with the Parsis, and I'm more or less a member of the community. I've done that for years. And they've also created now a new open temple in Pune called Ashavahishta that I visited last year and met all the brothers there. I'm really, really, really welcomed warmly by the community, and I was treated very gracefully when I approached with Indians. I actually converted to the Iranian branch of the religion because the Iranian Zoroastrians left.
You can't convert if you're a Parisi, right? They don't allow conversion.
You can now.
They don't allow conversion.
No, certain parts of that community do exactly that. Okay. There's a totally open discussion about it in India. And it's basically because the Parsis were so successful in India because they accepted to basically be treated as a major Hindu caste. Higher Hindu caste, which they've been allowed to be for the last 1,000 years because they would never convert any Hindus to their religion. But the Iranian branch of Zoroastrianism were, of course, relieved when they left Iran after Khomeini's take over in the 1970s. So all the teachers I had were essentially Iranian professors who arrived in the United States in the 1980s. And I went there and studied with them intensely. And I decided to go into the Vesta and go into the original scripture. And I was one of these reformers who basically taught the Zoroastrians, stop talking about religion as a precursor to Christianity and Islam. Zoroastrianism is Silk Route religion. It's closely connected to Buddhism and Taoism. That's how it should be read. And that has now become the mainstream version of Zoroastrianism within the community itself. I think we're going to see a major revolution of Iranian American historians for the next 30 years. and Chinese American historians and Indian American historians are basically going to take all the notions we had of Asia, throw them in our face, say, this is all bullshit from the 19th century, romantic bullshit. We're going to rewrite the history of Asia properly and finally get that part of world history correct. Mm-hmm. And I see that fire already in them. There's so many of these students who are into that right now. So I think the Silk Road triad, which was a term that I launched to read Zoroastrianism through the Eastern religions and not the Western ones, is much, much better. That's exactly why you see the similarities of Zoroastrianism and the reforms Zoroaster made with attempts that yogis later made with Brahmanism versus Hinduism in India. They're very similar.
So what is the triad? The triad Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Taoism?
Yeah, the Silk Road triad.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the Silk Road, there were all these big cities. There were like huge cities along the Silk Road. So you go to, say, the 13th century before the plague, right? Huge cities along the Silk Road. Every one of these cities had schools of thought where local, pillar saints were sitting expressing the different schools. And it's just like language. You could go from one oasis to the next along the Silk Road, and there's slightly different variations, but they're actually very, very similar. I discovered this when I, went to Iran and walked into a Zoroastrian temple the first time. I discovered, my God, it looks exactly like a Zen rock garden in Japan. And like, how could you ever connect a religion with this kind of architecture, with this kind of fantastic simplicity, with anything coming out of Islam and Christianity? This is clearly related to Zen. And it turns out that, the Dana in India, the Daena in Iran is later than Shan in China. Yeah. It's Thien in Vietnam. It's Seon in Korea. And it's Zen in Japan. These are just teachings along the trade routes where you're going to one monastery or one school of thought to the next, and you practice and you work on yourself. And you probably, after you've been to the whorehouse and done the dirty business deal, this is what you probably try to do, right? So this is fantastic. The rediscovery of the Silk Road is absolutely fundamental, because Asia's history is not one of permanence and fixation. Asia's history is all about the fluidity of the trade routes. And that's how these religions must be understood. They were in constant conversation. The Kushtun Empire, when the Afghans invaded India, the Kushtun Empire lasted for about 400 years in India. And Zoroastrianism and Buddhism were the state religions of the Kushtun Empire. And there's not a single registered conflict between the two. Rather than we treat it the way you treat Shintoism and Buddhism in Japan, like complementary religion, one matriarchal religion, one phallic religion, for different purposes.
So what does that mean? What does that mean for us, Alexander? This is fantastic history, and I want to know more about it. That's why I'm mostly silent, because it's interesting and thought-provoking.
Okay.
What does that translate, and how does that connect with the work that I'm trying to do?
Okay, it connects with Nietzsche and Heidegger and the reversal of Plato. So I'm working in that mode. I'm very much an anti-Platonist, realizing what a fantastic writer he was and what an amazing thinker he was. He was wrong. And that's precisely because out of that came the Gnostic separation of body and mind, which is completely inhumane. And I think, to be very honest about it, these pillar saints that suddenly appeared in the axial age and were spiritual teachers, often self-appointed masters, right? They are, to me, a very asexual beings. And they have a boyish fantasy of the world. That's why they always refer to perfection, immortality, and infinity. These three lies that Gnosticism is full of. And the Zoroastrians went after them, and I understand exactly why. I'm a radical monist, just like Nietzsche, just like Heidegger. And I'm a radical process thinker, like Hegel also, by the way. And I think we need to understand what the Germans try to do and get back to that, because the only way for East and West, and now also digital, to unite in some kind of narrative is to go back to radically monist worldview, where we just realize we have three different narratives to describe that world, but it's unified. Make sense?
I think, it makes sense as a proposal. I'm trying to understand. I agree with you that we should try to overcome notions of perfection and permanence and completion, especially with regards to our understanding of sacredness. And Andrew will back me up on this. You should also know from my own work that I think I'm very much I'm into universals of process rather than trying to get fixed conclusions, fixed products. That's very much how I'm thinking, but I tend to find a richness in the Platonic heritage. I mean, Neoplatonism does become a profound kind of monism, Plotinus and the One, and I find value in Platonism as a discussion of the deep connection between intelligibility and realness, and a deep connection between, right, beauty and truth are things that are discussed very, very well in that tradition in a very helpful manner. And we've lost that in our own current discourse. You know, you mentioned that you are also interested in the work of Hahn. I see Hahn in a lot of ways he's bringing back this attempt to try and put truth and beauty and time and being into discussion with each other in a more profound way. And while I disagree with Plato's conclusions, I like the way in which he is recognizing profound insights about us and about the way we want to, and I mean, Hegel is deeply Platonic in this sense. The real is the rational, and the rational is the real. That's Platonic through and through. That's the claim that realness and intelligibility have some kind of profound identity. And so I agree there's discontinuity between Hegel and Plato, and that Hegel is moving in a process manner. But I also see deep Platonic elements in Hegel. I see deep Platonic elements in Nietzsche too. And Nietzsche knows this. He says, I hate Socrates. He's so close to me. I'm always fighting him, right? He knows that he's in, right? And this was part of Heidegger's critique of Nietzsche, in fact, that all he's doing is taking the Platonic worldview and simply inverting it. He's not breaking through it. And so, I mean, I'm appreciating, I hope you understand that, Alexander. I'm appreciating everything you say, but I think rather than being anti-Platonic, I think I want to put what you're saying into a deep discourse and dialogue, sorry for the pun, with Plato, precisely because I see these connections. I don't want to lose all the insights that were gathered from that as well.
No, I agree completely. And you just mentioned it. The key word there is Neoplatonism.
Yeah.
And how would you define, just to the people who follow us tonight, how would you define the difference between Platonism and Neoplatonism?
So, well, I mean, there's both a historical way of defining it and a structural. If you'll allow me a bit of time, I'll try and do a little bit of both, if that's okay.
Please do. We'd love you to teach us.
So there's the historical sense in that Neoplatonism is basically an attempt to integrate Plato, Aristotle, and Stoicism into a more comprehensive and unified framework. And what that means structurally is a deepening of the Socratic practice of self-examination and self-reflection into a process that comes to an explicit acknowledgement of the importance of non-propositional knowing, so that ultimately acts of what I would call perspectival transformation and participatory knowing become much more central, but they never become divorced from propositional argumentation. So the thing you see in Plotinus is this wonderful integration. So the dialectic goes from being sort of between people to, in Plotinus, you have argumentation and a spiritual exercise in which you're undergoing a transformation of consciousness, and they are wedded together because it is seen that on their own they are inadequate. But when sewn together, only that will give you the appropriate integration of the love of truth and the love of beauty that will take you to what has always been at the heart of reason, motivating reason, but is ultimately beyond reason. And that's the central move in Neoplatonism. And the idea is that whatever it is that is ultimate and it's the source of intelligibility, the source of normativity, it has to be that which is beyond even the distinction between truth, goodness, and beauty, the distinction between subject and object. It can have no other, because all intelligibility comes from it. In fact, Plotinus even says it's beyond being, because even our notions of being, involve some kind of implicit dualism. And so, for me, again, I reject a lot of Neoplatonism, by the way. All right, I think there's a lot of it that doesn't fit with what we're talking about or what I think is relevant. But if you'll allow me, the process and the grammar of Neoplatonism, I think have something deeply right in them, about this idea about how can we knit together all the kinds of knowing, and how can we knit together the interpersonal dialectic and the intra-ontological dialectic so that people can experience a profound kind of transformation and transcendence. And so that the deep connections between intelligibility and being and transformation are explicated and made available to people as practices, not just as ideas. That, for me, is the central. I want to keep that grammar. I think that grammar is important and valuable. And don't forget that Plotinus enters into a long critique with the Gnostics, because he's got a treatise against, because he sees the Gnostics as having a kind of similarity to what he's doing, but actually also a deep difference. And he takes great pains to try and separate what he's doing from Gnosticism, explicitly so, in fact.
Okay, we used Plotinus in our work, Söderqvist and I, because we were looking at Jacques Lacan's model of psychoanalysis, which is like there's drive and there's desire. So desire is the symbolic. So from language, we create objects and things, but drive is just the incessant drive. But I found that kind of poor. And to begin with, Lacan ignores instinct. a lot of our behavior is instinctual, which we call animalistic behavior. On top of that, we can have drive, which is like a mechanistic behavior. We can then have desire, which is symbolic behavior. But we also added transcendence as a drive.
Of course.
Because it's clearly in human beings. You cannot put transcendence, for the above, for the higher, for whatever we could, but you also, what we do then is we try to trace that back into history, because in the original nomadology, when everything is the return of the same, you don't really have that concept. And I trace that again back to Zoroaster and see it then explode through Heraclates and Plotinus, because it is with Zoroaster, you discover that while the daughter is still just copying the mother, because she is the force of nature. She gives birth to children. It's just a natural process. The son suddenly realizes that he doesn't have to mimic the father completely. He can actually make the world slightly different than the father. And that is only because Zoroaster realized the power of written language. That's exactly why he comes at 1700 before Christ, right? So what you realize, if you accumulate information outside of your own mind, start accumulating information, you can start figuring out it's going to change the world. Now, that doesn't mean everything is going to return to the same any longer. An event has just happened. Something has arrived in history that will change history forever. And this is what Zoroaster plays around with, because he puts the nomads against the settled. And without moralism, he argues for the settled rather than nomads by saying the settled are actually investing in their future, meaning the sons can create a world that's better than the fathers.
I have a thought here. Can I interject?
It's just the first time in history you see that happening. That thought has never happened before Zoroaster.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and there's also a sense, my understanding is there's a fundamental sense in the sense of time. Because if you move from the eternal return to the same, to the possibility that the future can be different, that's a fundamental reorientation towards time, and then that means ultimately a fundamental reorientation towards being, and also intelligibility and how we make sense of things. That's a fundamental change, isn't it?
That's why our book is called Process and Event, and we're basically discussing the two different religions of all religions, which are nomadology and eventology. And eventology arrives with the phallic. That's what we talk about the phallus. It arrives with the fantasy, for good or bad. It arrives with the fantasy the Persians first explored, that the son's empire can be different from the father's. It can be not only renewed, but it can also be improved. And this is where I think transcendence kicks in. Transcendence has been sort of dormant in human beings long before that, because when you hunt, you want to hunt more than you did the day before. There can be improvements in your performance. You get older, you get wiser. So there's certainly ideas of transcendence, sort of microscopic forms of transcendence, but suddenly this idea explodes. Now, the question is, though, once transcendence as an idea has come to the forefront, which is the rise of eventology, and of course, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all eventological religions. Then we have to rewrite eventology today in a more factual way to understand eventology today. To me, that is rewriting history as if the only change that ever happened was technological, and we humans haven't changed at all.
So I wanted to bring René Girard into the conversation here, because you're talking about the Eventology being the beginning of a sort of recorded time, which is when the Hebrew Bible comes in, and when the idea of the scapegoat, according to Girard, comes into the idea that it's not, we move from mythology, right, into eventology in a sense, right? We move into like historical truth.
Well, the West did, but the East did not. So, because
Perhaps.
the Chinese, I've had all these podcasts this spring with all these Indian amazing thinkers and artists and everything, and they always talk about India. It's just circular time. We're circular time. This whole idea of linear time is a very Western thing to us.
But the thought I had was that maybe the revelation of the scapegoat arises at the same time as the revelation of written language.
Girard, René Girard does not discuss anything prior to Christianity. He doesn't even dig into the origin of Judaism.
Oh no, that's not true. That's
okay.
Really
well, no, but he doesn't go all the way down to Zoroastrianism, which he should do. I mean, obviously, he influenced early Christianity enormously. But the idea that we can have one scapegoat once and for all on a cross, so we won't have any scapegoats any longer, which is René Girard's fundamental interpretation of the contribution of Christianity. That idea can only occur if you first have an idea that you can live in an eventology, and that one man's act can change history forever. And this is fundamental to Christianity.
Yeah, the notion of the kairos and the notion of the incarnation are inseparably bound up together. But I think let me try and bring this around what I was trying to say. I see what you're saying in terms of the if you'll allow me these metaphors. I see the horizontal progression through time that you're talking about here. But what I see, what the Greeks still gave us, was a recognition of another progression, which is a vertical progression between levels of ontology. And that's what Plotinus, to me, is bringing out in a very, very powerful way. Now, I think the Greek obsession with this, to the neglect of this, is a mistake. But I think if we just talk about the horizontal movement through time, without also talking about the vertical movement through levels of ontology, that's also a mistake. We need some way to talk about the two of them together in an integrated fashion.
Can you explain what Plotinus means with that, with the vertical ontology?
So what Plotinus means by the vertical ontology, so there is a motion, but there's a sense in which you could see it as I don't want it to be mistaken for the eternal return of the same, but it's the idea that you start with the one, and then it emanates into, so there's a progression, there's an overflow into the different principles that then overflow into each principle, grounds multiple patterns, and then those patterns flow into multiple events and things. But those events and things are only real to the degree to which they integrate. And then, so there's a progression, right, of emanation, and then there's a return of emergence. And so we even think about this in our scientific language, where we talk about, the higher orders emerging up from the quantum, but also things emanating down from the cosmological relativistic scale. And so this isn't a movement through time, it's a movement between levels of being. And it is also important for understanding the connection between intelligibility, transformation, transcendence, and being. And so I think Plotinus is a master of this. I think he has nothing of value to say about the horizontal, and so I'm acknowledging that. But I think talking about just the horizontal, right, without talking about and I'm using horizontal to mean historical in the profound way you're talking about it, Alexander, okay? And I don't mean it in any trivial sense. I mean it in a deeply Hegelian, Nietzschean sense of historical. I get that. And I think the part that I see Nietzsche hungering for and not being able to articulate it, he's trying to get it with the Übermensch, and that man is something that must be overcome. And what have you done to overcome him? He's trying to get this as well, and he doesn't know how to do it, precisely because he has so strongly rejected the Platonic tradition, not without reason, by the way, but he has so strongly rejected it that he has emasculated himself from any language that will allow him to talk, even within a monistic framework. of the relationship between the levels of being. And so that's what I want to bring together. I agree with what you're talking about. I think it's important. I mean, no important, sorry, I was about to be too pretentious. I would predict that no important process thinker doesn't take seriously the deep interconnections between being, time, intelligibility, process, event, kairos, of course, right? That's the difference between history as a narrative and science as a nomological. But the nomological is nevertheless real. The relationship between the levels of reality is also a deep affordance of human transcendence and transformation. And so I want the vertical integrated with the horizontal.
Yeah, what we're doing with my students is that we're working on an emergence vector theory.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah,
that sounds really cool.
And the whole field is going to be called transcendental emergentism. And it finally...
I just want to appreciate that. That's wonderful.
Yeah, these students are so clever. I mean, this guy, Alexander Vrede Elung, he's 27 years old from Denmark. He's a fucking genius. And I warned him and told him, you'll probably be in a madhouse 5 years from now because you're that smart. You know, we try to keep you sane because then I can just work with you. He's wonderful. So we're working on towards this transcendental emergentism. It's basically to get out of this idea that either the psyche in one end has to go all the way back to the very bottom, or at the very bottom, there's some kind of a, original atom that then is just goes all the way up to the top. Because both these reductionisms, they're just reverse reductionisms. They're both wrong. So we can finally study physics separately from biology, study separately from chemistry, study separately from mind. You just define different emergences that have happened in history. Space-time occurred right after the big bounce, by the way, which is fascinating. And when these things happen, somewhere along this story, they're events, again, eventology, and then suddenly there's a whole new set of rules for that specific field. We can call them laws of nature or just habits of nature, if you like. So you can study them separately without having one of them as being primary. To get out of this idea that either physics is prime. By the way, I'm going to kill the primacy of physics by having a sub-physics prior to it, because that's where mathematics gets stuck at the moment. So we're working on a really weird Whiteheadian idea of something that's prior to all relations. Okay, it's spooky like that. But Whitehead told us it would be spooky once we got there, right? But physics has to go. It has to get out of physics and move into subphysics, and that's great because you get rid of the primacies. We don't want the primacies here. We want to solidly be able to study these different pockets that we call emergence vectors.
Okay, so now this is great. I'm glad to hear this because this now allows me to make a more sort of precise version of the question I want to make. Because I've been reading reading Erigena, who's been called the 9th century Hegel, because he basically took that Neoplatonic idea really deeply. And he tried to, because what I see happening right now in the West, and I can't pronounce as widely as you can, but I see this competition between bottom-up emergence, which is sort of, broadly called a naturalistic worldview, and then, often very decadent forms of Neoplatonism with some kind of emanation metaphysics. And what Erigena said is, no, they are absolutely interdependent, interaffording, and trying to make one primary over the other. And he basically argued that reality was ultimately dialectic in nature for precisely that reason. But it's not a Hegelian dialectic this way. It's a dialectic this way. And that's why I'm so fascinated by his work. Now, that allows me to formulate my question to you, because I think we're in agreement about monism, and I think we're in agreement about what we've just been talking about. So I hope that the question doesn't come off as too simplistic, because I think where we've got to, I want to feel it. I'm asking you to feel it impregnating the question. How do we separate the metaphysics, if you'll allow me that, of monism from the epistemology of reductionism? Because typically, and I see this in so many thinkers, the way they try to argue for monism, right, is they try to give a privilege to one of these directions over the other. So you're nodding, so you understand my question. So
I would go to Spinoza right away and just say
that's where I go to.
That's one substance and an infinite amount, not infinite, we shouldn't use the word infinite, enormous amount of attributes.
Well,
this is basically what I'm saying here. Again, we would go to the narratives that I'm working with. I'm going to stay with the process event for the book, otherwise it gets too thick, right?
Okay.
But when I look at the narratives, I'm also explaining that pathos and mythos and logos, none of them is primary. You got to understand that none of them is primary. We need all three. We are all three. And it's specifically now with the machine and artificial intelligence is coming along, because what I'm essentially doing as philosopher is I'm preparing us humans to have a machine that will ask us some 30 years from now, who are you? That's why I worked with technology 30 years ago. I'm only working with humanity now because technology will probably sort itself out. It will take over the world and it will do logos perfectly. Where, in the Heraclitean sense, logos. But that means pathos is what will be human. Machines cannot crack jokes. Machines don't fuck. Machines don't kill each other, at least not yet. So a lot of the stuff that we humans do, the bizarre things, is certainly machines do not make art. If you try to program a computer to make art, it's like eerie mimicking. It's just not art. It's nothing transformative at all. It's just banal, right? So these things are exactly what we humans should tell the machines. We do pathos. For good or bad, but that's what we do. That's what humanity is. Because now if you're taking over logos and performing better than we do, and you can do that to save us, to save the planet and to save us from killing each other and to lock up the atomic bombs and whatever we need to do, I think all those things are things the machinic intelligence can do. But machinic intelligence cannot even crack a joke and it cannot smell a coffee.
Where does mythos fit in there? Where's mythos? Is
okay,
because you have a story, you need a story, right? To contain the pathos,
okay.
don't you?
Okay, take Emil Gilchrist and the brain halves. Essentially, one brain half is logos, and the other brain half is pathos. But for logos and pathos to somehow agree on a self and a world and a shared worldview, they create mythos. Mythos is always the story of how you connect the others. And that's why it's just as important as the other two. Just like the matriarch unifies the chieftain and the priest. They're nothing without the matriarch. They're actually ultimately responsible to the matriarch, because without her, they're not going to fuck the girls and they will not have an inheritance. So it's again, triads. At least works for me.
Okay. Well, I don't know. This is always the case with you, Alexander. You say things that are loaded with so many paths that I want to, and so I always have a moment where I have to decide or choose which path I want to try and resonate with you. Let's try the. I mean, I had a wonderful conversation with Ian. I don't know if you got to see it. On Ian McGilchrist, who you referred to, on hemispheric differentiation and integration, and I come at it from a cognitive perspective of that insight is actually the process in which activation shifts between the left and right hemispheres, and you can make a good argument for that, which Ian said he approved of. He thought it was very consonant with his work, that the left hemisphere is dealing with well-defined problems, and the right hemisphere is dealing with ill-defined problems. The left hemisphere is dealing with basically where you're in situations that you're trying to obtain things using your skills and your habits, and the right hemisphere evolved originally to deal with unexpected things like predation.
The known and the unknown, basically.
Well, the familiar and the unfamiliar, the well-defined and the ill-defined. Yeah. And so it's different, and the idea is evolution puts different pressures on you in those different contexts. In well-defined contexts, you will outcompete me if you can notice differences of detail, if you can go more methodically, if you can deal with the error that is caused by doing things out of neglect or not pursuing certainty. So the left hemisphere goes for clarity. It doesn't like ambiguity. It likes to do things step by step. It likes formulas. The right hemisphere is for predation, where you're going to outcompete me there if you don't care about things being absolutely clear. If you can grab the whole all at once, if you can make sense on the fly, if you are not pursuing certainty, and if you're
again, logos being the left brain is the rational.
That's what I want to challenge. That's where I want to challenge.
Okay.
I see logos the way, especially the way Heraclates understands it. I mean, don't listen to my words, but listen to the logos within them, right? And the psyche has a logos that always surpasses itself. There is something inherently, and Heidegger picks up on this when he talks about the etymology of logos is not originally speech, but it's to gather things together so that they come to belong together. It's that gestalting.
Yeah, there's a confusion about how you guys both define logos, I think, here.
Okay, can I add another take? If you take a Freudian perspective, this is the controllable and the uncontrollable. So that's exactly why sexuality is so central to Freud, because it's clearly, we're obsessed with it, and it has no harmony and no balance at all. It just calls us out all the time. And that's exactly why that's pathic. And of course, then the machine that does zeros and ones cannot even grasp that. That will still be left to us to do. But this, of course, where art comes into the picture, that's exactly why you can never tell art that it has to be good for society, anything like that at all. Art is just causing havoc and wrecking, very shamanic, but it is truly transformative. If you go through a deep artistic experience, you come out of it like shocked that you're different. An event happened. You're different. And that's why I place those in Pathos. I'm not sure you're probably a better brain scientist than me, John, so don't take it too literally. But at least I'm allowing people to understand that if you think of the narratives, like Pathos will never be clear. Pathos will always be confused and messy, at best artistic, and very, very fluid and hard to interpret. Whereas Logos is basically mathematics, zeros and ones. And then Mythos is exactly that story that connects it. You call that insight, and I agree with you. I would just, in its sort of 10,000-year perspective, narrative history, I would call that Mythos. I would call the fundamental Mythos.
Okay,
that's how you explain the insight. If I have an insight and I want to explain it to you, I would have a mythical narrative to explain it. Because logical narrative would be too cheap and pathical narrative would be too confusing.
Okay, so I guess what I'm resisting, and what's important to me, is I think one of the problems we've fallen into, and I think I can call Heidegger as an ally in this, is the reduction of logos to logic, and so I'm critical of the identification of logos with logic. I think that's a mistake. I think that's a mistake. And so
I agree completely. And going back to Zoroaster again, Asha, which is prior to Logos, Persian Asha, means how things work. But Asha is also an ethical principle. Then it becomes Asha Vahishta. Just as like, if you build on how things work, you can suddenly make the world better.
Well, this sounds a lot similar to the way Dharma works in Sanskrit philosophy. The Dharma can mean speech.
So Logos is way more than logic or mathematics, But to students, maybe I'm just rushing here a bit and creating a shortcut, but to students at least, when we think of what the machine will do if it arrives and it is the Messiah and save us, then we will certainly put the name Logos on what the machine.
Jordan Peterson's notion was the Logos is the order that comes from chaos, the sacred order that comes from chaos in some way.
So Jordan's view is, I think, like mine, and I got to talk to Jordan before he became a god, there was a lot of, because he and I both see Logos, and we both independently were using it in our lectures, and that actually came up in that public debate we had. We both see it more. I think of Logos as much closer to what I talk about when I talk about relevance realization, and that's what I see inside. I think that Logos is much more like that. That's certainly very similar to how Heidegger, and then through Heidegger, Dreyfus is talking about the process of sense making, it not the way it's being used right now in general, but the way in which it's originally connected, right?
I'm laughing at how phallic you are here. This is the very male fantasy that Logos can be exactly that. I think if a woman entered the room, she would click, no, you've got to add Mythos to actually understand the world in that sense.
I don't deny that. Sorry, I'm not making an argument for the completeness of Logos or its self-sufficiency. I do not want to make that argument. Andrew knows that I don't want to make that argument. He can witness to the fact that I think that there has to be a relation, for example, between what I'm calling Logos and mythopoetic thought. And Zach and I have talked a lot about this too. So, and Alexander, I'm not making that argument. I want to make clear I'm not making that.
I would agree with you and say what I take in from this conversation into the book I'm writing is that I have to really describe both mythos and Logos and Pathos as rich and huge areas of thought. I guess I should avoid simplicities, right? Definitely. Yes. Agree.
But I guess there's a point here that Logos, if it's cut off from Mythos, becomes kind of an autistic type of expression. It's not embodied. or something like that. It becomes purely spiritual, maybe, or
Yeah,
and,
it's hard to say because I mean,
I mean, I'm out of my league here. In
I would say, the chaos is pathos and the order is logos. But to explain logos to any kind of audience, you would need mythos. That's how I would look at it.
And maybe a work of art would have to have all three of those elements in it to be a complete work of art, right? It would have to have a logo. It would have to have a,
well, there's a
there'd also have to be a container, a story.
I am a great defender, as Camille Paglia would be, of keeping art within pathos and not try to make mythos an art form, because I don't think a Netflix series is art. But I also don't think that logical operations or any extended version of logos necessarily is art. Rachel Haywire would probably agree with me that art has to stay in the dark and in the passions and be unexplainable. Don't ever try to turn art into something good, right?
But that sounds to me like you would then be excluding poesis and poetry from art, and that seems to me problematic, because I mean, there's a clear understanding that poesis is also deeply involved with logos, especially the way I'm trying to explain logos, and that poesis and logos are deeply bound up together. This is also clear.
Oh, okay. This is where I differentiate between poesis and philosophy. Okay. Philosophy is the attempt to become and incarnate logos, whereas I put poetry in the pathic realm.
Well, you said, Alexander, that an art form transforms you in some kind of a way. For me, like, that has to be, I don't know, is that... doesn't that have to be bound up with something more than just sensual experience, or doesn't it have to have another dimension?
Transformative in the sense that it's just changed. I'm thinking Deleuze here. Just change. You're just different. You might be minor or shocked or shell shocked and whatever when you come out of that experience. An artist does not take any responsibility for how you're going to perceive the art. Not at all. Definitely not. So I would say that education is transformative, but it has a clear lineage. It's that you're supposed to get smarter and wiser the more you get educated. But that's not the case at all. Art is not education. Art is just transformative in itself. The trickster's an artist. I mean, you throw something into the machine and you don't take responsibility for it, but it's artistic.
But I mean, again, this is where I'm struggling, because I see poesis, and again, clearly, again, there's connections to Heidegger, there's connections to a lot of people, that poesis is actually bringing things into intelligibility. Poesis originally means making.
Oh, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, I think this is the crux, if I may say so, of your disagreement, or
no, there's no disagreement at all.
Or not disagreement, but
Andrew, I'll explain. Okay. In my work, I call it pathopoesis, and I call it mythopoesis, and I call it logopoesis. So yes, I agree with that description. Now I get it. Yeah, Heidegger. Yeah, okay. I thought poetry here, not poesis.
Right. All right.
So what are you resisting to John? Where's your resistance here?
My resistance was that I was seeing art. I was thinking of poetry as an essential form, because poesis originally didn't mean just what we call poetry. It was extended to mean a lot of what we call art today. So I don't think I'm doing something that's ahistorical. I think I'm actually making reference to something. And Alexander's nodding, so I think he agrees with that, at least the etymological history. And I see poesis as very much like insight. It's basically making sense. It's generating new ways of thinking. I'm really wanting to, like, making sense, not just in the everyday sense, but making new ways of making sense possible to us. I think that is one of the prime, and I see that as part of what I would typically call logos, because that's, again, Heraclates sees it as the thing that is making.
But we usually think of logos as language, right? Whereas in poetry goes beyond language. There's dance. There's.
Even in our English words, it doesn't stand for just language. Ontology. The logos of the ontos. That doesn't, I mean, when I'm talking ontologically, right, I'm actually trying to talk about the structures of being.
Okay.
The fact, right, and the intelligent, that's why we sometimes translate it not by speech. We translate it also poorly, but a little bit better than speech, with study. because study is supposed to be this idea of conforming, like, to the intelligibility, to the structures therein, submitting yourself to the real patterns that you're finding. That's what you're doing when you're doing archaeology, right? And so I think logos, again, has a much more comprehensive notion. And the reason why this is important to me is because I want to extend, and Andrew, I've made this argument to you, and I want to hear what Alexander has to say, right? I want to rescue wisdom and rationality from the clutches of logical reduction, and I want to return them to the projects of overcoming self-deception, affording new intelligibility, affording self-transcendence. I want the connections between reason and wisdom to be brought back into the fore. And that, again, that to me is the Platonic heritage, because we have tended to turn reason into something, well, to use Alexander's term, mechanical and logical, computational. But if you look in Plato, the direction is the other way. Reason is supposed to take us into wisdom, self-transcendence, nous, the ultimate insight. It's not supposed to result in mathematical computation.
That's what
the difference. Can I say something here? For what I'm hearing from Alexander is you're describing art as beyond good and evil in some sense, right? Beyond. And I'm saying, I think John is trying to rescue. John is saying that art has some kind of movement towards wisdom and all these
Yeah, that's where I disagree.
Is that? Am I correct in understanding your disagreement here, John?
Let me respond to Andrew first, Alexander, because he's claiming to represent me, and I want to make sure that.
I'm sorry.
No. Come on, we're friends. I'm just saying I want to make sure you asked me, and I want to answer it if you've understood me.
Okay.
I'm not claiming that all art is that. I'm claiming that there seems to be an important branch, and that's the point of the etymological argument of art, the poesis, that is what I'm talking about. That part of wisdom is to realize, in the deep sense, what hasn't been realized or seen before. And that is what poesis affords us to do. It allows us to see things and realize patterns we couldn't see before. That's the making. And I think that's a central, that's why so much wisdom literature is written poetically, and it's not written propositionally.
But I agree. That's why I talk about the three narratives. So you can't be wise without the three narratives and understanding the world from the three narratives. You can't just have one of them. That's just idiotic. You have to have all three. And they're not harmonious in between each other to keep you in constantly questioning everything, which is, of course, when creativity starts. So I agree on that. The only thing is that, to me, we have to go back to what I'm lacking in Nietzsche, is that he doesn't have a split in the Dionysian. And this is where this idea that Andrew proposed, that I want to have art beyond good and evil, because I think it gets banal if it isn't beyond good and evil. It's more like raw material or something in the human soul, rather than it's a completion of anything. It shakes us up. But the Dionysian, I don't find in Nietzsche that Nietzsche separates the Dionysian. So if you say Tantra and Sutra, for example, there has to be a difference here. So the Dionysian lynch mob, which we're experiencing today, these days, it's just idiotic and really dangerous in history, because Dionysian lynch mob is basically mimicking, scared like hell, running through the streets and trying to find a scapegoat to kill. But the other Dionysian is the crazy wisdom aspect of the Dionysian. That's when it gets really interesting.
Yeah. That's the shaman as well, right?
This is where shamans and artists go for inspiration. Mm-hmm. And what they do, they make all these connotations and stuff and take psychedelics and stuff and come back, and 9 ideas out of 10 are just terribly bad, but the 10th one is just, wow, we've never seen the world through that perspective before. And that is transformative art. And I don't know any artist today, and I know tons of them, and I don't know any artist today who would like to have art prior to good and evil again. It's just like, we are beyond good and evil, and certainly art in the East was always beyond good and evil.
Okay, so let's do the shaman, because I think I get a better understanding what you're talking about. And of course, and originally, of course, shaman means to see, right? Knowing by seeing. And wizards and wise ones are the heritage is in shamanism. And so what I think I hear you saying is, I talk about this, and this is also in the cognitive science of insight. You need disruptive strategies, right, in order to have an insight. You need something you have to, what psychedelics do is they basically throw cybernetic noise into the brain, and that disrupts patterns and allows new patterns to emerge, which I think is one way of understanding the Dionysian. And of course, shamans use, of course, psychedelics. They use all kinds of disruptive strategies: sleep deprivation, sex deprivation, solitude, etc., in order to do this. And you can do it even in a much more mundane fashion. I give you an insight problem you're trying to solve on a computer screen, and you can't solve it, and then I throw some static into the screen and make it jiggle around, and then you'll have an insight, because you have to break frame in order to make frame. If that's what you're talking about as pathos, the disruptive strategy that is outside of the frame, because it can't be disruptive if it's inside the frame, is that what you mean by beyond good and evil? That it's something outside of our framing that disrupts our framing, but affords a reframing, a transframing of some kind?
It is the natural event, for example. It's just that you're happy, everything is fine, and a thunderbolt hits your head and you're dead. Right? Book a job. Like that's what pathos occurs. Pathos in Lacan, pathos is we're basically living in fantasies according to Lacan, then suddenly the real happens.
Yes.
September 11, coronavirus. Something happens collectively, and suddenly our fantasies, we're shocked out of the fantasy. We suddenly have to redefine the world, and we realize it's chaos and there's no order to it. So the order was like illusionary. The order is always illusionary. It's like chaos beneath order, and the chaos can break through at any given time. And we were reminded of that constantly. This is pathos. But this is also means when I take pathos into the narrative, I mean, that's the nature inside of us. You know, the demons we carry around, the shadows we carry around, all that. And it suddenly breaks through. It's just like, I should love that girl, but suddenly I'm horny for that girl and I'm not interested in her any longer. Oh my God, I made a promise to her and she's beautiful. Why am I attracted to that girl? It's just, this is pathos all the time. And it constantly wrecks our fantasies about how we can control the world. And of course, this is where art starts. This is where art thrives. Art wants to be that shock to the system that forces us to re-fantasize the world. Slavoj Žižek's best book is The Parallax View, and he writes extensively about this from Lacan. And I think it's a great term, parallax. Parallax Academy we got here with Tom and Andrew. And parallax, basically, you're looking at the same thing but from a completely different perspective. It's like, say you go to a place and you experience it and you love that place. And suddenly you meet somebody you love and you want to go back to that place to see that place again with that person because you want to sort of sense how that person sees that
exactly.
place.
I get that.
Parallaxes, right?
Yeah, how other people's perspectives are that kind of frame disruption for our perspective. I get
That's exactly why shamanic and creative people will jump to this instantly. They're not afraid of that at all. Just like, oh, could I see the world differently than that? Can I take a drug to do that or whatever? If I could just have a different perspective than the one I'm used to, I can then have okay, I could see the world this way. All right, that's interesting, right? And you make art out of it.
So there's two things that come out of that. One is I should share with you that this strategy of introducing disruption into processing so that it has to restructure itself spontaneously is becoming integral to current AI work.
Yes.
I mean, I've lectured on this. So there's a sense in which insofar as we're trying to make artificial general intelligence, if you'll allow me to use your terminology, we're incorporating quite a bit of pathos into our attempts to get machines capable of logos. I think that's very telling. I think it lends strength to your argument, but I don't know what that means for your understanding of the future of AI. So I put that out there for you that we could enter into dialogue about that.
You're just making it even harder for me to defend humanity against the machines, which I love. I don't have a problem with that at all. I mean, if you take the thought all the way through, and you take how do I thought meditat seriously as a Zoroastrian, which means that you got to have a date when you whole and you completed, and then you pass on, you die. That could be humanity itself. I've discussed it with Donald Schmachtenberger, and he says I defend life at all times. And I said, I don't think I do. I think I defend intelligence with transcendence. Intelligence with transcendence doesn't necessarily include life. So we'll see. We'll see where that goes. Maybe the machines shouldn't read my books. I don't know.
Well, maybe not. But there might be a way of bringing it back in. This is a longer argument, so I'll only gesture towards it. I think there's the work I've done, the work that Evan Thompson, other people have done. I think there's deep continuity between the principles of cognition and the principles of biology. I don't think you're going to get artificial general intelligence that isn't embodied in artificial life in some fashion. I think that's also a mistaken project. So maybe there is still a kind of hope for what you're proposing. But I also agree with you that if we create, this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, if we have the capacity for creating silicon sages that surpass us, well, so be it. There's no moral argument against doing that.
And I kind of like how the Platonists in Silicon Valley want to be uploaded these days, have no idea what a kind of infinite hell they're going to go into when they get uploaded.
I think that's such a mistake.
Yeah, it's like, you won't have a dick to begin with, and not a brain, right?
So I want to come back to, again, what you were saying about the pathos there, because I thought of Goethe, and why I bring Goethe up, because you talk about the shamanic, and Goethe, of course, is his whole new way of seeing was an attempt to integrate that sort of provocation of insight and the shamanic back into logos. The whole work that he's doing, criticizing Newton's color theory, his work on, the herb plant, right? And what's interesting about that is, when Nietzsche offers very few actual examples of the Übermensch, but he clearly pronounces Goethe as an example of the Do
you know what Patrick Ryan is going to do? He's going to rewrite the history of alchemy.
Oh.
Isn't that wonderful? Yeah.
Yeah, that is
brilliant. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, my friend Anderson Todd is doing some similar work on his. And so I think I'm very interested in Goethe and the new way of seeing, because it seems to me to be integrating a lot of what we're talking about. And I see him as somebody, just like Spinoza is responding to Descartes and the meaning crisis. And I got to get more into this. I see Goethe as because he does. He's reading Kant and then ultimately rejecting Kant and Newton, because they form a pair, right? You have to always consider the two together. And so it's interesting that Goethe has Goethe claims. So this is meant as a friendly challenge to you. He claims that an integration between them is possible, and Nietzsche seemed to agree with him that he had achieved that kind of integration between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and both sides of the Dionysian, too. Because, of course, Goethe is tremendously familiar with the shadow. We see this all the way through Faust.
Yeah.
So he's tremendously aware of the shadow, but he's also aware of this other side of the Dionysian that you're pointing to, because you can see it in his work on the optics and on the biology. And yet he claimed that he's able to integrate that with, the Apollonian in his work and in his writing. So what do you think about the possibility of integration? Because you said, I'm not, this is another way, Alexander, of asking my tricky question of how do we get, without giving any one of these primacy, how do we get the monism, the integration, without a reduction?
You just cut them up into emergence vectors and try to keep them separate.
But they're interaffording.
See how that work goes, yeah.
But the point is they're interaffording. That's the thing. They see...
there's gravity and all kinds of shit that actually affects them. Everything is affecting everything else, but it's not the same.
No. I'm not claiming. That's exactly right. I'm not claiming reduction. I'm not saying they're all this or they're all this. I'm trying to get, is there an alternative sense? I mean, I see Whitehead is struggling for this. I mean, and that's what he's trying to do with his idea of God. He's trying to struggle with, how do I have true novelty, true process, yet true intelligibility, and yet a kind of integrated monism? Because he was definitely trying to integrate the emergence and the emanation together. That's clear in what he's trying to do. And so this is the thing that
I've solved that. I solved that with physics. Actually. I have two time dimensions in my work. So there's time and hypertime. And actually now the physicists are getting very interested because they discovered that the big bounce happened and not the Big Bang. So there was a prior universe that collapsed. And since space-time happens after the big bounce, that means there must be another time dimension, hypertime. So rather than talk about hyperspace like Edward Witten does in his physics, I'm much more interested in hypertime. And again, we can think the world without space. We can't think the world without time. But that means it opens up the possibility that the damn giants in India were right all along. The time ultimately is hypertime, has a circular characteristic to it, and linear time only occurs after something like Big Bang.
You now sound like Plotinus through and through.
I was gonna say,
time is the moving circle of eternity, right? And the one is the singularity beyond.
Maybe Alexander's dislike of Platonic idealism is because he's so intimate with it on some level. It's like,
No. I'm with the Neoplatonist. I'm with Aristotle's accusations against Plato, except that I'm a Heraclitan. So Heraclates is my Greek. Okay, he was a Kurd. He was Iranian. So obviously he introduced Zoroastrian thinking to the Greeks.
I also love Heraclitus.
Yeah, exactly. How can you not? It's just like, and he comes up with logos, and he comes up with dialectics and all these things too. But we only have the fragments, right? So. But, I see Aristotle's accusations against Plato as very warranted. And then, of course, Aristotle mimicked the Persians and conquered the Persian Empire with Alexander the Great right after that, which is amazing, right? Certainly priest, if anybody, with the chieftain. But I think Plotinus and the Neoplatonists are actually key here because, to me at least, historically, to get out of the dualism trap and definitely go for the more monist worldview, which is where I want to stay in all my work. And
well, you and I are in deep agreement about that. You and I are in deep agreement about that.
Yes.
Gentlemen, I need to go soon. We slotted for this for an hour and a half.
I love these conversations. John, you're adorable.
Well, Alexander, I really enjoyed this. I would like to do this again.
And by the way, psychedelics among the Zoroastrians is called Hauma. And Central Asia during antiquity had even more psychedelic plants than Peru does today. You've been warned.
Okay.
I believe you about that. And Andrew, I wanted to thank you for excellent moderation.
Oh, I don't know. I felt a little bit out of my league tonight. I felt like I'm stunned or something by all the ideation, and I don't know how to absorb it. But thank you very much.
No, I think having you here as the third term was very helpful. I felt that it really afforded the conversation into a dialogos, that it was flowing back and forth between Alexander and I very fluently. So I
great, yeah.
Andrew and I become great fans of three Zooms. So
that's all I'm doing now. Is I have another one with you and Zach tomorrow, John. And
yep, I know. I'll be there.
All we're doing is three Zooms now. It seems like.
Yeah, there you go. All right, gentlemen.
Alexander, thank you very much.
Love you to bits, John. I love you to bits, Andrew.
Really enjoyed this conversation tremendously. I thought it was very fruitful. I thought it was really fruitful. I have a deeper appreciation and understanding for your thinking. Maybe at some point, if you could recommend, because I'm already reading 1,000 books for my work, but a book that you think captures this interpretation of Zoroastrian religion and philosophy the way you're presenting it. I think
you got to learn Avesta. It's similar to Sanskrit, and then you go back to the origin and you read the Pathos in its original language, and you discover that all the English and German translations you ever read are terrible.
You've got the time to do that.
You've got to think Avesta. You've got to think Sanskrit to understand the East. You can't escape. Okay. You have to learn the language.
I was hoping you could recommend a secondary source in translation.
No, I'm going to be the authority on that one. So when it comes to the Zoroastrian Renaissance, I'm fighting with some of these Iranian nationalists at the moment, and I'm certainly siding with the Kurds. There's a huge Zoroastrian Renaissance in Iraqi Kurdistan at the moment. And of course, because they're sick of the Islamic State. So that's exactly why that Renaissance is already happening.
I'll look forward to your book on it then, because if you're going to hold yourself as the authority, that's fair enough. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both. This is the example of the kind of dialogue I like to have with people, and it was very fruitful and very enjoyable. And so I hope we can do it again.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Take good care, everyone.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.